Get going. Okay, great. Okay, we can get started with our keynote this morning. I'm very excited to have Dr. Megan Racey with us. Dr. Racey completed her PhD at the University of Guelph in the Department of Human Health and Nutritional Sciences, where she worked directly with dairy farmers, adolescents, and schools to communicate dairy products and alternatives as foods for health. Through her consulting experience, she's worked directly with stakeholders across the agri-food sector from farm to fork to create impact from research and help inform evidence-based decision-making. You can find her battling misinformation and consumer misconceptions about health, nutrition, and our agriculture sector across social media platforms as the Nutrition Babe. Welcome, Dr. Megan Racey. We're happy to have you today.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here and get to talk about what I'm most passionate about. So even though my work right now is focused heavily on research, I'm so passionate about science literacy, our agriculture sector, and how that relates to consumers, food, and health and nutrition. So we will get started. So a little bit about who I am, just in case you don't know me already. So a few keywords there. I am a researcher. I'm a communicator. I focus on health and nutrition and all of that from fork to farm. So what does that mean? I've done my PhD in human health and nutrition. It all focused on how to communicate foods for health to different target audiences like adolescents, working with dairy farmers, as was mentioned, and right with schools and teachers. So of course, my background focused really heavily on that nutrition health science, and then spanned how do we talk to people about that science and bridge that gap. And the fork to farm relates to my most recent consulting experience and what I've kind of been doing since my PhD, which is really trying to tie that gap from the consumer perspective back to the farm. So we do a lot of really great work where we're trying to communicate how from the farm side and from agriculture, just how what we're doing and why it's important, but consumers still have those questions. So I am trying to work to communicate it from what's the consumer perspective and what kind of questions do they have on the farm. So I have a few different handles there that you can follow me at on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Definitely Twitter is very active, I think, for agriculture and nutrition. I got a lot of engagement with teachers and audiences of different ages. And then Instagram, different audience, different focus, and a little more fun. And recently did a video all about if the whole world went vegan, what would that mean? And why that maybe is not as easy as it sounds. So if you want to take a look at any of my channels, they're there. So just a quick, excuse me, a little brief background about food and health literacy. So it might sound obvious, but food literacy requires more than just knowing about food. It also requires food skills. So being able to prep and cook and use a knife, and self-efficacy and confidence. So being able to know that you can cook those meals and feel confident in following a recipe. There's ecologic factors, so things external to us, of course, knowledge, and then food decisions. So just what do we like? What's culturally relevant for us to eat? And why do we make the decisions we do about our food? So the Ontario Federation of Agriculture did a study in 2017 that actually looked at parents and millennials and teens, so different age groups, to see what do they know about food and health literacy and how can we help them. So probably not surprising, teens mimic their parents and how they plan and prepare their food. So less than 50% of teens regularly prepare their own lunches for school. So either someone else is preparing them or they're just not making their own lunch. And as well, depending on the age group, in terms of how they purchase their food and make those decisions, teens don't really look for the nutritional information on and nutritional labels on foods, and they're not really looking for local foods. So they have probably more about a convenience mindset, or just eating what parents provide or what's available. And then shockingly as well for food skills, so knowing how to plan and prepare a quick, healthy meal, only 28% of teenagers said that they knew how to do that. So that's a pretty small proportion, and I think that's reflective of the way education has gone, and the busy lives of now our 20th century families. So while knowledge is only one piece of the puzzle, it's important to know where students go to get their health information. So this really stems from my PhD work. So what we did through my work is I did focus groups with adolescents to say, okay, where do you go for health information? What's interesting to you? Do you Google it? Do you talk to people? So where are you going to get that information? And then from that, we asked them, how do they like to learn about health information? And then I designed a randomized control trial. So that's an intervention where I went into the schools and taught them in a way that they said would work best, using tools that they learned from. So not surprisingly, male and female teens, they go to their parents, the internet and media, and school and teachers for health information. So that's what they're saying are their top and preferred sources to get information about their health, their personal health. So this is why I'm actually so passionate and excited to talk to you and teachers and do this ag education, because it's yet another reason why you as teachers, educators, people in the school system working with teens and adolescents and children of all ages are so important in sharing factual information. So a little side story, when I was doing those intervention visits with the schools, so it's with grade 7, 8, which I learned is a really fun age group and potentially not my favorite age if I was going to be a teacher, which is why I'm not a teacher. But in working with those students, what I learned is just really how much the teacher shapes the discussion and what goes on in the classroom. So one of the intervention visits we finished, it was a discussion about dairy products and alternatives and how they're healthy for us and can be part of a healthy diet. And I opened up for questions and we were having a discussion with the students, and the question period got a little quiet. And I think the teacher, in trying to fill the void and ask a question, started asking questions about animal welfare and the treatment of animals. And the students didn't have those questions naturally. So in it being an important topic to discuss, I was happy to talk to the students about it. It wasn't what their interests and where their mind went for questions. And the teacher really steered it in a negative direction, not just simply asking questions about how animals are treated on farms, but they started asking questions about, aren't they mistreated? Aren't they abused? Aren't there antibiotics and pesticides and all these things in our food supply? And it just kind of put a little bit of a negative spin on what was a positive session with the students. And so this is why I'm really passionate about talking and providing that unbiased factual information to teachers and educators everywhere so that you're armed to be able to have these discussions without maybe your personal reasons influencing. So just before I bust a few myths regarding nutrition and agriculture, I just want to give you a few facts to share with your students and a little bit of background on what consumers think about our agriculture and food sector. So in general, being Canadian, consumers trust our agriculture system, and they're definitely interested in learning more. So a recent 2020 research by the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, every year they do a public trust research survey and questionnaire with Canadians, and they release those results publicly. So you're able to go look and see them and see what the trends are in our agriculture system. So 47% of Canadians feel that our food system in general is headed in the right direction. And a whopping 87%, even given COVID, trust that the food system will ensure the availability of healthy food for all Canadians. So we have a great ag system. People are very positive about it, but consumers actually know really little about agriculture, and they're willing to admit it. So they have strong opinions about it. They feel good about it, but they don't really know a lot about agriculture. So for example, one of the key insights shared through the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity research was a question that when asked if agriculture chemicals are more toxic today than 25 years ago, 32% said yes. So a third of respondents said yes, and a quarter said they don't know, which I think is probably a more accurate answer. And those under the age of 25, so this survey only goes to people 18 years old, so maybe not who you're engaging with, but certainly they are influencing. They might have siblings who are in this age group, and that's influencing the students you're working with. So the under 25 age category was much more likely to feel that agriculture chemicals are toxic. So 41% of people in those age groups said they are toxic, or more toxic than they were 25 years ago. And so that's a huge myth, considering we know way more about these chemicals than we did 25 years ago. There's much more research that goes on to have these chemicals in our food system. So this is just an example of where they're answering questions and saying, yes, it's more toxic, but I don't think they really know. So when consumers were actually directly asked if they know, like how much do they know about farming practices, 48%, so almost half said they know a little, but 42% said they know very little or nothing. So they're admitting they don't know a lot about it, but 60% of respondents say they want to know more. So this is the group we need to be targeting and talking to. They're admitting that they don't know a lot about agriculture, but they do want to know more. So it's not that people are naive or trying to ignore our agriculture system, but I think it's hard to find the right information. So there really is a need for critical thinking in an era of social media with overwhelming sources of information and in a time when everyone's an expert. So where are we going to find this good information, and who can we trust when you can go on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whichever, and find anything about anyone? You can go on Google, do any search you want, and probably find something to support your motives and what your beliefs are. So from the 2020 public trust research, Canadians actually say they have a high level of trust in farmers, and second to that is university researchers. So that's great. People trust what farmers are saying, which is awesome, because all farmers want to do is tell us about how passionate they are about their careers and providing food for Canadians. And university researchers, as we know, dedicate their life and their science and research to the study of various parts of agriculture. And that's really what I've learned through my career, is just how many associations and career paths and options there are, and that tie back to our agriculture sector. And this holds true even by province. So that was Canadian-wide research I shared on the last slide. But on this slide, Saskatchewan actually does some of their own little insights and research with consumers and Saskatchewan residents. And I highlighted just a few key facts here. So 54% of those respondents said that they trust the agriculture sector is transparent in how they communicate their practices. 88% trust farmers and ranchers, and 73% trust that those farmers are taking care of the environment. So we trust farmers, we want to go to them for more information, but are we? So people often, probably not shockingly, say what they should do and might report what they know is right, but we know that people are going to Google and websites to get health, nutrition, and agriculture information. And this is leading to several misconceptions and the spread of misinformation. So just a few common trends and misconceptions about nutrition, health, and agriculture. So these are some key highlights and trends that are seen across different consumer studies, public trust studies that I've seen in my own work through different research, as well as all of my social media work to educate the public. These are kind of the 5 key topics. Each of these could be an entirely own 30-minute chat or more. So I won't have time, obviously, to go into a lot of the details of each of these, but just to talk about my experience with them, some of the research, and really focusing on how these matter to nutrition and health, since that really is my background. So sustainable eating, it means a lot of different things to different people. The FAO defines it as diets with low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. So Overall, sustainability is associated with food options and production practices that address climate change and have a positive impact on the environment. So Canadians are wanting actions to ensure that we have a sustainable food system, and they want to see what those actions are. So they're really looking deeper now into this sustainable eating to know that it's not just a buzzword, but that the food they're buying and the farmers they're supporting are actually doing something to make a difference with sustainability. Um, so in the recent surveys, a majority of Canadians, 55%, say they're doing things like sourcing foods with less packaging, and they're demanding friendly food options. So younger Canadians are actually more likely to seek out these environmentally friendly food options. And as their purchasing power increases with age, so too will the demand for these options. So we know it's important, but what do people think is sustainability? And that changes depending on who you're talking to. So again, here, this is some US data. So it's, we're heavily tied to the US and what trends we're seeing there. And the food systems are so interconnected. And so overall, I mean, people will go based on taste and price, but you can see that there is an increasing preference for environmental sustainability to be part of why they're choosing foods. And 59% of these respondents indicated that environmentally sustainability in foods is important for them to choose what they're eating. So then when you're asking people, what does that mean and how are you choosing these foods, that varies. And the definitions aren't necessarily so scientifically sound. So one of my favorites on the left here is the US data. So these are perceived factors to know if a product is produced in a sustainable way. So what do people think is sustainable? And then on the right, those 5 top factors are the Canadian data. So what do Canadians think is sustainable food? So of course, labeling is important. My favorite from the US is that it's labeled as non-GMO. So apparently non-GMOs are sustainable, and that's, again, a misconception we can talk about, as well labeled as organic. So a lot of people are associating organic as more environmentally sustainable. From the Canadian perspective, it goes beyond just local food and positive impacts on climate change, but also about safety for the family. And what I really loved is this nutrition for you and your family. So a nutritious food is sustainable for people, and also that it provides a healthy standard of living for farmers. So that's great because sustainability is more than just the environmental side. It's also about the people working in the sector and making sure everyone can have a good living wage and good work conditions. So my most recent video that I did on Instagram and shared across all my platforms was, can we eat our way out of climate change? And I really feel like we're not focusing on the right parts if we're thinking about just eating our way out of climate change. That's just the tip of the iceberg. We're missing the big elephant in the room. And one of that is about food waste. So I'm really passionate, and this has to do with food literacy and how we're cooking and using our food. Because if the food wasted in the world was a country, if all of the contributions to the greenhouse gas emissions was calculated for just food wasted, it would be the 3rd largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the world, after, I believe, China, and I think the US is 2nd. So it is a huge, huge problem in our food sector, and most of that is attributed to households. Us as consumers, we waste 47% of the food along the whole value chain that's wasted. So that's throwing out food before it's really bad because we don't understand best before dates, not understanding how to use food, buying something with the intention of using it and wasting it. So essentially, majority of the food that you buy can just be discarded without even putting it in your fridge. And so that's a huge contributor to access to food and environmental impacts and sustainability. So in Guelph, Ontario, which is where I did my PhD, they have done some studies looking at food waste specifically in that city, and looking at the avoidable food waste. So of course we have unavoidable food waste like a banana peel, really hard to use those. or an eggshell, things like that. But if you're throwing out the banana entirely because it went bad before you ate it, that's avoidable. So the study found that most of the food that's wasted came from fruits and vegetables. So people are intending to eat well and then aren't. So why? How can we get people to eat those fruits and vegetables? And all of that equated to about almost $1,000 a year. So that's money wasted. And I really think that instead of focusing on different diets and being vegan or not, we really just need to focus on let's eat the food we have in our fridge right now, and how can we support people doing that. Another big misconception is about regulations regarding animal welfare, antibiotics, and pesticides. So in general, pesticides is really in the light every year when there's this list that's put out called the Dirty Dozen. So the Dirty Dozen is put up with the Environmental Working Group, and it takes some data from the US Department of Agriculture and tries to align it with what produce you should be choosing for the lowest pesticide residues. But it's not based on scientifically sound data, or not data, sorry, methods. The methods they use to take the data from the USDA is very sketchy, to say the least, and it really overstates the risks. And what it's doing is it's presenting conventional produce and agriculture in a worse light than organic. Even though both use pesticides, it's saying that conventional produce has higher residues and is more dangerous to consume than organic. And what the consequences of this are is that we already know consumers aren't eating enough fruits and vegetables for healthy diets and food. We're wasting them and throwing them out. So now we're scaring people off eating fruits and vegetables in general, and it actually disproportionately affects low socioeconomic status families. So they get more confused with this mixed messaging, and they're more likely, because they can't afford organic produce, which is what these lists scare people into, they're more likely to just not buy fruits and vegetables, which is the opposite of what we want people to do. So a fun little thing you can do, and maybe you can do this with your students if they have questions about pesticides residue on fruits and vegetables, is you can go to safefruitsandveggies.com, and they have a pesticide residue calculator. So here I did one. You can do it for male or female adults, teens and children. So here I did one with how many strawberries would you have to consume as a teenager to reach any high pesticide residues. And the results are that a teen would have to consume more than 363 strawberries in one day. And even at that number of strawberries, they still wouldn't even have any effects, even if all those strawberries had the highest residues recorded, which are still often within safe limits. So here's an example of no one, I don't think, has ever eaten 363 strawberries. You can do it with different fruits and vegetables. So an average female, I would have to consume 774 servings of spinach in a day, and I still wouldn't have any negative side effects from any minute pesticide residues on my spinach. So it's totally blown out of proportion, but one thing that consumers do care about is how animals are raised. So again, the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity asks questions about how much you care as a consumer about there being residues for different drugs and antibiotics in their meat or milk and eggs. And so they definitely are concerned and have strong opinions about it. But a lot believe that even if animals are sick, they should be given antibiotics. So that's great because we do know that antibiotics are important for animal welfare. But there are misconceptions about how antibiotics are used and hormones are used in the care and treatment of animals. And so consumers may misunderstand, and while they care about animals, they want them to be treated well, they still care about those residues in their food, and they don't always understand all the regulations and rules that go into making sure there aren't these residues. Again, so in BC, this holds true where consumers want to know how their food is grown and want to make sure that they follow certain standards. So it's, again, in the gray and blue, shows how it's very important or somewhat important for consumers to know where their food is coming from and making sure that the farmers are following regulations. So even though the use of antibiotics and pesticides overall is highly regulated, consumers still, again, don't understand that, don't know that, and they think that there's a need for more regulation. So the research from this year showed that almost 60% of consumers think there should be more regulation regarding pesticides and chemical use in food. And GMOs, which we probably won't have time to dig really deep into, is the most researched food on the market, and people, 40%, still think that there needs to be more regulation of them. So tying this back to nutrition and health, since that is really what I went to school for and what my background is passionate about, and why I'm so passionate about these misconceptions is really how it's negatively affecting people's eating and healthy eating. So clean eating is hard to define. It means different things for different people, but essentially, it's eating, we're not talking about washing your fruits and vegetables, which is all you need to do is rinse them with water to remove any pesticide residues. Clean eating, people are talking about essentially eating foods that are void of certain ingredients. And I always say to people, I really don't think you should be basing your diet and the healthiness of that based on what's not in your food. So clean eating can, look at non-GMO or gluten-free or all these free from labeling. So unless you have a dietary reason that you need gluten-free, I really don't think you should be choosing a food product because you think it doesn't have something in it. You want to be choosing your foods and diets based on what is in it and how nutrient dense those foods are, which a lot of animal products are, a lot of fruits and vegetables are. So for GMOs, we won't have time to dig too deep into it, and it's not my area of expertise in terms of the science, but it is important to note just the impact that GMOs have had, how safe a food they are. And one fun example I like to remind people of is that a lot of these GMOs are being used to save some different crops. You can look up GMO examples of the papaya, where it was being decimated by disease, and they were able to save that crop by having a GMO developed. And as well, you can look up golden rice. So that is a rice that's really high in vitamin A, and it's being grown in countries where vitamin A deficiency is common. Organic versus conventional farming and produce is always debated because there's this myth that organic is better, and that appeals to nature fallacy is what it's called, where natural nature produces things that are good and synthetic is bad. But all of the research, all of the studies that have investigated whether organic foods have better outcomes for health have failed to link organic foods to better health. So in general, the minute, small differences in the nutritional value between organic and conventional foods is so small it's not having any difference on our health. And as well, I always like to remind people that organic still uses pesticides. It's just a different category of pesticides. And you often need more land, more labor, and you have lower yields on those farms and on that land. So sometimes it takes more inputs and more land to get less food. So it's a misconception that one's better than the other. I think it's amazing that we have choice and we get to look at whether we want to eat organic or not. Plant-based is another trend that we see coming up over and over and over again. And I just like to remind people that plant-based diets aren't always created equal. So this is US data, but it just shows how there is a few protein from plant sources, plant-based alternatives that people are starting to consume more of as those green bars increase. But unless you're eating a plant diet that is high in actual fruits and vegetables, eating a processed plant-based diet with some of these processed food varieties isn't necessarily going to be healthier. So watch for those plant-based marketing tactics and schemes. It doesn't always equate to health. So lastly, I just wanted to finish out my presentation in the last few minutes just to talk about minding the gap. So that's what I say there, and what I mean by minding the gap is just looking at the nutrition, the gap in our knowledge about nutrition and the health of our food and how that relates to farming practices. So we really need to be bridging that gap, and that's what I'm passionate about doing and hope I'm doing with this presentation and some of my social media work, to just align how we might have misconceptions about things like organic being healthier for us, but it's not. And I don't want people being scared into buying a certain food or not based on misinformation. So just some critical thinking for science literacy, I've called this. So look for balanced reporting. Not all sides deserve equal weight. So science is meant to weigh the evidence, and we study and research and look into all sides, but that doesn't mean that all sides deserve equal weight in their reporting and are equal in terms of their value and quality of science. So you really need to be looking at the totality of what science is saying. What are all the studies, the guidelines, the expert panels, researchers, what are they saying on a whole, not one individual study? So again, I always like to remind people that correlation doesn't equal causation. So what I mean by that is, for example, ice cream sales is heavily correlated with shark attacks. I mean, that doesn't happen in Canada, but maybe in Florida it does. But does that mean that ice cream sales cause shark attacks? Likely not. It's because they both increase in warm weather. So that is not a cause and effect relationship. Also, there's a lot of bias to look for in science. So, there's perceived bias about how we're interpreting, and my own personal preferences. Confirmation bias, meaning that I'm always going to look for things that confirm what I already believe. And then the Dunning-Kruger effect is referring to people who know the least about a topic actually have the strongest opinions about it, and often will simplify things and make it sound very direct. So my favorite saying when I'm talking about nutrition, health, anything, is it depends. That's very boring. People don't want to hear that, but it really does depend. So I can't say one diet is better for you, or one food is better for you, or one farming practice is better. It really depends on the whole big picture. So watch for people who are oversimplifying and making things sound more direct than they are. Also, I think we need to be good storytellers. So when we're having these communications, facts alone aren't enough to change hearts and minds. So people have values and preferences that we really need to relate to and have a shared connection to really make a difference in their understanding. And you might probably find this with students or other people you talk to. If they're not interested, if it doesn't align with what they think, they might not resonate with them, and they might not have as much of a change in their mind or be as open to discussing it. I think teachers are great storytellers too, because somehow you always keep a room full of however many students you have engaged. So what can you do really as people listening to this presentation, and I hope what you take away from this is that you can be a balanced and neutral source of credible information to help build science literacy and critical thinking skills, and be able to just share some evidence-based sources of information. So to help you do that, I just finishing up with a few activity ideas. So depending on the age group you're working with and how big of a project you want this to be, something that you can do with your students is to look at the media and maybe have them search the media. It doesn't have to be health related or agriculture related specifically, but it could be, and have them work to create an accurate science-based news headline. And that could translate into them writing a more accurate article or a social media post, however you want to be creative with this. And I'll provide an example of this in a moment. And then from that science-based news headline or article, or that science-based social media post, you could have them find a creative way to present the information. So I always like infographics and posters. I think graphics are a really key way to share information and really useful. So this is an example of some headlines where, again, looking for that oversimplification. Does eating soy increase breast cancer risk? They're saying it doesn't. Then the next study line, a headline is saying soy is tied to longer life after breast cancer, but now soy doesn't provide or doesn't worsen breast cancer. And you could find literature and headlines for both sides. So maybe what's a more accurate title for an article that's talking about soy and breast cancer risk or something. So you could have your students work to create. It's probably going to be a longer, more boring title, but that's part of the fun. They have to get creative. And how would they present the science more accurately in a catchy headline? And this is an example of a really simple infographic. So the Canadian Nutrition Society, they have great examples and tools with infographics. So this was created by a friend of mine when she was in her PhD a few years ago, and it's just about protein. Really simple: who, what, when, why, and how. So what is protein? When should you eat it? Why do we need it? How are you going to get it? How much do you need? And who needs to be eating protein? So these are really fun ways. And if anyone's interested, there's a website called Canva, so Canva, canva.com. I believe it's .com. And it's free, and you can use their website to create infographics like this, and they give you a lot of free icons too. So this would be a really creative way where students could take that misconstrued headline or news article and turn it into something that's a little bit more interesting. So in terms of some resources, and I believe we'll be sharing slides, and this is all recorded. Of course, always going to your Federation of Agriculture and looking if they have some information. So each province has a Federation of Agriculture, and as well there's the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. 6x16 is a food literacy challenge that the Ontario Federation of Agriculture is putting on right now. So it's virtual, and it's all about cooking meal challenges. So you could maybe use that with your students or show them. Farm and Food Care, again, they have different province chapters and offices, and they do virtual farm tours. So you could watch a farm tour with your students. They have dairy farms and other animal farms. They have crop farms as well. And there's a magazine called Real Dirt on Farming. And so here's a few examples. It's free. You can look at it online, and they talk about everything from humane treatment of animals, environment, to also the safe and healthy food. So my favorite, they talk about GMOs and Dirty Dozen, so you can look for more information there. And they even have career profiles. So this just shows how, you don't have to be a farmer to be in the agriculture sector. You can also be something like a product development specialist, and that would be someone who's done a food science degree. Some documentaries, if you're interested. One is Guardians of the Grasslands, which I believe is going to be free to stream, and then in this week or next week, in the next coming weeks. And it's only a 15-minute documentary, but it talks about preserving our prairies of Canada. So that's super relevant to a lot of attendees today, since you're in the prairies. I'm not, I'm in Ontario, a little less pretty, but talking about how the farmers are actually preserving the natural landscape and grasslands of the prairies. And food evolution, that one's a bit longer and very science-based, essentially heavy in science. So maybe for an older audience, but it is one of the best documentaries that debunk some of those other less science-based ones. And then, of course, if you're looking for some social media engagement and posts, Food Science Babe, Farm Babe, and then myself, Nutrition Babe. There's a reason we've all called ourselves that, with the babe at the end, just to combat what Food Babe is doing, since she's not science and evidence-based at all. So they share really great resources. Food Science Babe is, of course, a food scientist. Farm Babe is a farmer in the States, and she recently moved to Florida and does a lot of farm tours. So there's a lot of engaging content there. So that is it for my talk. I think we have a few minutes left for some questions. And I know there's been some coming in on the chat that I've not looked at. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I hope it wasn't too fast. And yeah, if there's time for some questions and we can go through some things, I'd love to do that.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was wonderful. We'll take a peek in the chat here. If you do have a question for Megan, we have a few minutes. She'll also be coming back to join our expert panel Q&A at the end of the day. So if you want to save your question for then, that's fine too. So we'll just I know we've got lots of great comments coming and people are chatting, which is great. I'm not seeing any questions right now, but feel free to jump in if you've got one.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad some of the resources I've shared. Obviously, I know Egg for Life would be familiar, and you guys have copies to distribute. So that's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to be sending out teacher packages with some of our resources to all of the teachers that have registered as well. Once we get you to complete a survey at the end. But that's great. We have a question here. Have you seen a change in eating and nutrition habits over the past year with COVID?
Yes, yeah. So with some of the research that's been done with consumers, and a lot of people already, some of these groups that I shared, the research that they do did pivot because of COVID. So they changed up their questions or looked for different trends. So definitely, especially in the dietitian world where they are focusing on, how to feed people and prescribe diets more. They've done some work too with consumers. And during COVID, people really are looking more for convenience. There's been an increase in snacking behavior, but there's also been an increase in cooking from home. I'm sure we all know about everyone cooking sourdough bread or baking sourdough bread, and banana bread. And I did not jump on those cooking trends and trains, but people are getting more interested now because they maybe have the time. So it's not all been bad, the changes with COVID. I know it's been really tough for the hospitality and restaurant sector, but in general, yeah, people have the time to be more interested in their food. So while they might be snacking more, they're looking for healthier snacks, or looking to make those snacks and bake and cook themselves at home. So it's been some positive, but some negative.
Great. Somebody else wanted to know, Neil wanted to know if the golden rice is actually being grown anywhere right now.
So I think I'm not sure if it's being commercially produced and used. I think there's been, again, GMOs are an example where the agriculture sector probably did not do a great job in communicating the science behind its benefits. And so there's a lot of regulatory hiccups, which is ironic that people think that there needs to be more regulation, considering it's actually really hard to get a GMO food from research concept into the market. But I believe it still needs final approval.
Yes, Kevin Folt is just saying here that it's not being grown, so he would know.
Yes, yeah, I was gonna say, I was like, people are experts, but it's sad that it's not being grown because, again, these technologies are helping communities who need more support in nutrition deficiency. So again, it's where this misinformation often is targeting those who are lower socioeconomic status, lower education, and those who really need it. So we're lucky to have such an abundant food supply that we can be choosy about non-GMO or not, but a lot of people aren't that fortunate. And what we end up doing directs a lot of food marketing decisions and research. So.
Great, thanks, Megan. There are a couple other questions, but I think we'll save them for the Q&A because they're a little bit more in depth. And we have a quick 2 minutes there if anyone needs to go and top up their beverage or take a quick little break. And we'll be back to start off with our Alberta Ag 101, what's growing in the field, in 2 minutes. So see you all in 2 minutes. Thanks again.